I'm Rowan Reid. This is the Hardwood podcast, and probably the first one we're ever going to run. And I'm going to start it over here in Western Australia, despite coming from Victoria myself. And I'm on the property of David and Di Jenkins, and I'm in their mill shed, and I'm looking straight at a log that's about almost a metre in diameter sitting under a Lucas sawmill. And David owns a Lucas mill, I own a Bandsaw mill, and I thought it might be really interesting to have a discussion about the advantages and disadvantages of each as small-scale portable sawmills. David, welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Rowan. Rowan's been over here finishing off a Master Tree Grower program, which is unbelievably amazing because he keeps coming across the country all over the place doing these courses. And we've got the opportunity to talk about our milling process, which we've talked lots about over the phone and over to each other. And I've run a Lucas mill now for many years, and I find them really good. They're easily portable. I put them on the back of my Rodeo ute with a couple of frames to handle the long bits, and I can take them from farm to farm. I do a lot of milling for other people, usually wind-blown trees, and find it very easy to set up. I can put it on the ute. It takes about half an hour to get on the ute, half an hour to get it off and set it up and have the mill running.
So you've had Lucas mills for a number of years, and this is not the first one you've had?
No, this is the third one.
Third one.
Yeah.
Now, that's interesting because we both started planting trees. I'm looking out the door at these 1987 planted Sydney blue gums, huge trees, beautiful forest we're in. And I planted our first trees in 1987. I've had 3 bandsaw mills in that period. Oh. So our first 2 bandsaw mills were Norwoods from North America, and the one we have now is a GT40 from Hardwood mills in Australia. So this is, what model of this Australian Lucas mill have you got?
This particular one's a 10-inch mill, Lucas 10 by 30 horsepower motor, 10-inch maximum cut, or 250 mil. The previous mills I started with a 6-inch mill and then went to an 8-inch, which I still have. I usually take the 8-inch to jobs. The 10-inch one's set up here in the shed. I like to keep it here, but occasionally people want some wider boards, so I take the motor head to wherever they want to have it. Both heads fit on the same frames, but this model is their latest model. I think it's their biggest mill. I find it very, very good because, as I said, easy to set up, quite quick to move, and once you've got the log in position and the mill on top of it, every time you walk backwards and forwards, you've got a piece of wood that's presumably usable.
So between the bandsaw mill, it's interesting again, I've got the largest of the Australian ones, and with a bit of hydraulics in it. But fundamentally, if we compare the 2 types of mills, yours is a swing blade, rotary. How do you describe what it is?
It's a normal saw with only 5 teeth. The blade runs vertically one way and horizontally the other. It swings with a lever that changes the position. It's all manually operated. You push it. There's no hydraulics. The mill sits above the log. The log sits stationary on some plinths which get it up off the ground a little bit. The disadvantage is that when you've got a big log of more than a metre, I think the maximum the mill will take is about 1.3, is that the mill, you're operating it right at head height, and sawdust and crap gets thrown into your face.
So if we compare just that's the swing blade, and the bandsaws are horizontal bandsaws. And the difference is, in this case, the Lucas mill I'm looking at, the log is sitting on the ground, as you said, on a couple of plinths. In our case, we have to put the log on the bench and run the mill along tracks. And the bandsaw mill only cuts horizontally. So to do a vertical cut, you've actually got to turn the log. And in your case, you turn the machine.
Turn the blade, yeah.
And that gives you... So your kerf, the amount that the blade actually cuts out?
Yeah, well, that's probably a disadvantage. Some people call them wood chippers because they have a 6 mil curve, which is quite substantial. If you're cutting tomato stakes, there's a lot of wood that gets thrown out in the sawdust.
Well, you do notice that, the difference when there's a very big sawdust pile right beside us, and on our mill it takes weeks and months to actually build up a pile that big.
Yeah, I can do that in a day.
The bandsaw mills run on about 3 millimetre kerf, or 1/8 of an inch. So when you move the blade up and down, you have to add 1/8 of an inch to it, so you account for that, and presumably you account for the kerf each time you do a cut as well by how far you move the mill across or down.
Yeah, the Lucas mill have these gauges on either end of the mill, which if you've got an offside helping you, it makes it easier and quicker because they wind the mill down at each end. I usually operate the motor end, and the offside operates the back end. But the kerf is set in the gauge of 6 mil right at the top of the gauge. So you adjust the gauge by adding that 6 mil each time you drop it, and the same thing on the horizontal gauge on the mill head.
So now most of the logs you're milling on the farm are relatively big eucalypt logs. Would that be right?
Yeah, and most of the logs around the district that I mill are jarrah or marri or a bit of blackbutt, and they're usually fairly big logs. Usually old growth trees that have been paddock trees that have either fallen from windstorms or wind damage. There's an amazing amount of wood that still gets pushed up and burnt in WA from people just don't realise the benefits of having these portable mills. They're starting to change now.
Yeah.
But yes.
Well, the closure of native forests might be turning, and the increasing price of timber, even just for cattle yards and fences.
Exactly.
It's changing dramatically. So in our case, that's one of the reasons people say, why did I choose a bandsaw mill? Why did you choose a Lucas? I think you really got to start with what you're milling up and how big those logs are going to get, how stable they are with regard to how you sit the mill around them or whether you put them on the mill. And in our case, I was looking for a mill that would cut from quite small diameter up to large, but the limit on ours is, well, it's called a GT40 because 40 inches is supposed to be your maximum, and in terms of how big a log could be. That doesn't mean the width of the cut is 40 inches. It actually just means you can get a 40-inch log on there and start cutting it off. And I have got up to a metre on it, and it does take a lot of work moving it around, and they're very heavy logs. But fortunately, the hardwood mills have an extremely strong carriage that you put it on. But we wouldn't be able to mill the log I'm looking at. So you've got one example there, log size, that says that one mill can't do what the other mill can do in this case. And the Lucas is certainly good for those big mills and the equipment you're using. Like if you go to a site, they might be able to pull or push a log, but not lift a log. And in this case, they could push it under the mill, or you could build the mill over it. So you set the mill up over the log, even in the paddock.
Yeah.
And so those big logs don't have to be lifted and moved. But in our case, we have to lift the log onto the bench, and that's getting really tricky. Even we've got a 100 horsepower tractor, front end loader, can't really lift 2.5 tons.
No.
And you told me how much volume do you think's in that log?
About 1.6 cubes.
It's only 3 metres long? Yeah, so...
That was the second log of a tree. The first log, 3 metres, had just over 2 cubes in it, and the tractor couldn't lift that. I had to...
So how long? How do you do longer logs? What's the...
The mill itself will cut up to... It's got 2 extensions that you can fit at each end, so it'll cut 6.3 with the extensions on. And I do have some other extensions. I can add another couple of metres in the middle. Yeah. And I have cut up to 8 metres long. Yeah. And then you can put 2 mills together. So I guess
you can go and borrow someone else's Lucas frame,
mill and frame, and you can add them together and infinitely long, I guess.
Yeah. Well, that's another limitation of the hardwood mill. I got a long bed, and I suppose you can buy and extend the trailer bed. And we've been, for our house, we cut 5.6s, 5.8s, I think, so we can get 5.3, 5.5 in the building. And that worked well. Those logs were so heavy. They were just pines, but I had to lift one end and then the other end and roll it onto the mill. But so that's one point. The bandsaw mill is great because it's got a narrow kerf. I find I really wanted one because I'm obsessed about quarter sawing, as you know, David. Mm-hmm. And we've talked about back sawn and quarter sawn, and if you're not familiar with that, it's the way that the rectangular sized bit of wood, which is generally what we're producing, you're producing 1 inch by
130 mil.
Yeah, so these are for floorboards. Yeah. For beams, it might be a 2 inch piece so everything's sort of rectangular. And back sawn means that the growth rings actually go from edge to edge, largely, whereas quarter sawn, they go face to face. And I've always been a bit obsessed about quarter sawing for a number of reasons. It produces certainly a more stable bit of timber. It's less likely to cup. And if you're milling species that might have fiddleback in it, you only see that on the quarter sawn face. And if you've got species like silky oak or English oak or Banksia or she oaks that have that medullary ray, you're not going to see that shine up unless you do it on the quarter. So I was looking for a mill that I could rotate the log and get that precise cut through on the quarter sawn face and get as much of that feature timber out. And it's worked really well for us because we're trying to do a lot of quarter sawn, make that our comparative difference with conventional timber supplies. And because of that feature and the furniture grade quality of the timber, I see that as a great advantage. Now, we've talked a bit about how you can do quarter sawn on the Lucas, and you can.
Yeah, you can. You can do a vertical cut like at the start of a log. You take the top piece off, it's just usually sapwood and bark, and then you can dive in vertically, have your long cut vertical into the middle of the log from the top. I tend not to do that. I just go back sawn, and then in the past I've pretty much back sawn most of the log because once I get to where I could get some decent quarter sawn, once you get to near the heart, I then started to do the vertical cut there. So I was actually avoiding the quarter sawn boards, and that was just because it was more productive that way.
Yeah, you get more material out if you do back sawn.
Yeah,
it's just whether I think, whether there's a quality difference or whether the market or your own use really cares about the difference. Yeah.
The flooring that I have been producing is from the Sydney blue gum here. It's very attractive. It's lighter than the local Jarrah wood.
Lighter in colour. And it's hard, and its floors. The floor layers have been very happy with the process and the way it's performing, and the finished product on the floor looks magnificent. So, and that's mostly back sawn. Yeah, you do get that wavy cathedral grain in the back sawn pieces, which people like. But like most mills, whatever way you do it, you're going to get a combination of both once you get into the... Yeah, that's true. It's rift sawn, isn't it? Rift sawn is halfway between. And the other point, particularly where both of us are milling eucalypt logs, particularly if they're long eucalypt logs from tall trees, they can have pronounced growth stresses in them. So when you cut along, you're releasing the inherent growth stresses in the tree. Now, we'll probably talk more about tree science in other podcasts, but growth stresses are essentially there to allow the tree to bend and then pull back up straight. So even a straight tree, if it's very tall, moving in the wind, may have tension wood forming on the outside. We're talking about hardwood trees like eucalypts, poplars, and casuarinas. These species often have a lot of pronounced growth stresses in them. So when you cut through a log, you're releasing that tension. And, the common term is a banana board. You cut a board, you're cutting straight, but it ends up, as soon as it comes off the saw, it's the shape of a banana. So what I like about the bandsaw mill is because I can cut up to, almost a metre right through the middle of a log, I can break the log down into 5 pieces. And then it's very tedious in a way, but break it down into 5 pieces, throw the middle core away because that has no value to me. And then those other 4 pieces, the growth stresses have been released, and I bring them back onto the sawmill and recut them.
Get them straight.
Recut them straight. In some cases, I have to even do a straightening cut. So if it's a 4 or 5 metre log, I might lay it down, had what used to be a flat surface on it, but now it's like a banana, and I might cut so that there's 0 at each end, but 4 or 5 mil in the middle, and to straighten that out. If I just keep cutting boards, they would be fat in the middle and thin at each end. So how do you find managing the growth stresses in timber on a Lucas?
Yeah, well, it's a good point, Ryan, because you can't have that straightening cut. You can possibly cut a big balk and then let the stresses do their thing and then do a straightening cut. But I don't bother with that. I find that the bigger the log with these fast-growing eucalypts, the stresses are much less, and especially if you parallel with the middle of the log, if you like, it's usually straight. Once you start getting, especially if you're doing quarter sawn from the edge, it'll spring away from the heart quite dramatically. But as the log gets larger, as your trees get larger, that stress seems to be a lot less.
Well, that was a good point you made. If you're doing backsawn boards, the stress is not a problem because it is called bow, and you can just nail it out. You can lay it flat, and when you stack your packs, the bow gets settled. But if you're doing quarter sawn, the stresses get expressed as spring, and that's when you look at a board laying against a wall, and it looks like a moon shape in the sense, and you can't get rid of that. You have to straighten, cut that out. So our timber, when it went to the sawmill, well, it's not a sawmill, it's just a finishing mill now, our local one, they edged those boards, and there's a lot of loss because they had to take off that spring in there. But so back sawing means you don't have as many problems with growth stresses. I'm obsessed with quarter sawing, so I have a growth stress problem, so I've got to break down the log, so I need a mill that does that. Yeah. So what we're getting to, I think, is really interesting. These mills, both Australian made, becoming quite common on farms. They really have some advantages, each one of them, and they have some limitations. Yeah. And I'm sort of tempted. I wish you lived next door, David, so we could swap the logs around. And the other thing, the bandsaw mills, like I look at that mill, it's like a big, big handsaw. Really, it's just a pretty basic machine. Yeah. Really. The bandsaw mills seem to be a bit more complex. There's more things that can go wrong, and there's more fiddly things. Yeah. So let's talk about the blades, particularly, because sharpening the blades. What can you do, and how long does a blade last?
Well, it's a bit like how long's a bit of string. Really, it depends on what you're cutting. A lot of our stuff I cut is from gardens as well. My son Adam's an arborist, and he brings home logs from people's gardens that have a dubious history of people making cubby houses and nailing there. I don't think metal does any blade of either a bandsaw or a Lucas mill any good at all. And there's only 5 teeth on the Lucas mill. It's easy to sharpen, and there's a little grinder that comes with the machine. It does a basic sharpening, if you like, but once the blades last quite a while if you're just cutting nice straight timber and not much stress in it. Some of the marri that I cut has a bit of tension and stress over the big knots, and even the pine with a big knot can throw the blade a little bit.
Okay.
I think it probably would with a bandsaw too, doesn't it?
Yeah, and you hit knots, and the blade sometimes rides over the top of them because they're following the grain.
But if it's sharp and it's running well, and the mill's set up as the specifications tell you to do it, it's usually a pretty good thing. You can re-tip the blades. I take my blades to a saw doctor, and he re-tips them. Just a little tungsten tip that gets silver soldered back onto the blade.
So do you have another blade in the shed that you change over?
Yeah, I've got for the 8-inch mill, I've got about 7 blades. This one I've only got 3 blades for. Yeah. So you simply swap them over. It takes 5 minutes. What happens is that sometimes the blades lose their tension and they end up like a piece of rubber, and they wobble all over the place. And there's an art in retensioning, which the saw doctor does. I don't even bother to do that. They hit it on an anvil, and some sort of magic voodoo does the trick. And, saw doctors are pretty clever. Yeah,
well, we hope we still have some around in the future. So we can compare it to the bandsaw blade. It's obviously a band, it's a circle, so when you hold it up, it's probably as tall as yourself. So it's got quite a few teeth on it. Yeah. You can get them with tungsten tip, if we have, or tungsten carbide tips, or just normal steel tips. If you're just using a normal one, if you hit anything, it's pretty buggered.
Yeah.
If you hit a nail, you're pretty well throwing that blade out. Otherwise, it'd probably 2 hours through our eucalypt hardwoods of milling, and then you'd swap it over. Right. And I've got a sharpener, and it probably takes 15, 20 minutes once you're set up just to tip each one to get a little bit more edge on it, and then it should work. And I haven't really recorded how many times we've sharpened some of them, but maybe 5, 10 times sometimes. I find that if it keeps working cutting straight, I'll keep that blade and go and sharpen it and put it back. Then the tungsten carbide ones, they start by, just feels like butter. They just go straight through beautifully, and they do cut for longer. And
can you resharpen those?
Well, I tried to, and I destroyed one. Yeah. And then I've since found out I'm using the wrong type of diamond tip sharpener. So we've got a new sharpener now, so a new carbide blades just came last week. So we're going to try sharpening those and keep that going. And the blades, you can get very cheap ones. I haven't really sort of worked out where the value for money is, but I'm still going back to Jeff at Hardwood Mills and buying theirs in the hope that he's had a lot of, he's been talking to Wood-Mizer, where a lot of the blades come from, the American Wood-Mizer company, and there's a lot of science in there in bandsaws as well. So I try to work it out, but like your saw doctor, I don't understand what they're talking about, But yeah, it's a big difference. You have to have a set of blades on hand, sharpened if you want to mill for a day. And if a blade starts to ride or waver through that, generally change it if it was set previously. If it starts off badly, you have to go back and look at the set of it, how it's running on the wheels and the tension, and try to iron that out. And some blades I just can't get to work at all, so I just put them aside and stick to the ones that do.
Do you debark your wood before you start?
Yeah, it makes a huge difference. Does it? Yeah, and debarking's not easy. The bark comes off eucalypts very easily, or most species. It comes off very easily if the tree is actively growing. So if you've got a good wet autumn or a good warm spring, it's actually a little bit dangerous. The bark just comes off and the log slides around, so you just let it dry out a little bit. But I can use the tractor forks or a spade. The other problem is, we drag our logs across the farm to the mill.
Rocks and stuff.
And you're picking up dirt and sand and rock, and you hit things like that. It's just not worth it. So get them with the bark onto the mill site and then rip the bark off. It's a bit of a nuisance having all that bark around the mill site, but you can pick it up with a loader and get rid of it.
I think the Lucas mill handles the bark a bit better.
Yeah, I'm sure it does. Yeah, because you've left the bark on this log.
Yeah,
I'll take a photo of both these mills and stick them up with the podcast notes. And you've left the bark on. To me, that would be, as soon as it's felled, you've probably got 12 hours to get the bark off. Otherwise, it gets really tight particularly if the sun comes out, and it becomes a real nuisance. So if you've got logs that you're cutting down in midsummer or midwinter, it can be really quite tricky. The other option is with the bandsaw is to just, and we're looking at this, use some sort of debarker that fits to the chainsaw motor, and you rip along
just to the mill motor.
So it goes along and it tears off the bark at the point where the blade goes in. Yeah. It doesn't matter so much where the band comes out of the log, but when it goes in, you don't want it picking up dirt, then carrying it all the way through. On the outside, it'll just throw it, so it won't tear at the blade.
Yeah, I see on some of the YouTube channels, the mills, they have a little head that fits just prior to the bandsaw going in, and it just cuts a little groove out of the way.
Yeah, I think, the Europeans, things like oak, or if you're milling here, blackwood, it's very hard to debark those species. Yeah. And
we generally not worry about debarking at all. If we roll them across our pea gravel here, which is ironstone, they just embed into the soft, smooth bark trees really well. So you've just got to make sure there's no rocks left in it when you're cutting.
So what we've been talking about eucalypts. What other species have you milled?
I haven't done. Well, I do all sorts, I suppose. I've done some beautiful red cedar tree that grew in someone's backyard that got too big, and because it was one of the few native species that actually is deciduous in Australia, it drops leaves.
Yeah, Australian red cedar, sort of Queensland, New South Wales species. We grow it on our place. Not big enough to mill yet, but I'm really keen to hear because it's a ring poorer species. The faster you grow it, the denser the wood is, and the better possibly the colour and performance of it. Have you got some of that I can take home?
No, the guy I milled it for is he stacked it away beautifully and ended up selling it for a really cheap price.
Oh dear. Okay.
It was in baling up and it just grew. It was probably 60 centimetre diameter.
So it would have cut really easily, wouldn't it?
It's like
it's
butter.
much lighter, more uniform.
And I've cut some Paulonia, quite a large log of Paulonia. That's another very, it's a hardwood tree, but it's very light and soft to cut and amazingly stable. The growth rings were a good inch apart. And we just chucked the wood in the shed floor and it didn't move. It was really wide. We had some good 8-inch wide planks and they didn't cut, bow or twist or anything.
Now I'm looking at, you've got little blackwoods coming up amongst, well not little, they're about 8 to 10 metres tall now, growing up under the eucalypts, and I really like that combination. Have you milled any Australian blackwood yet?
No, not a lot.
Yeah,
not grown from here.
No, not on anyone's farm?
Just trying to think back. Yeah. Not a lot, Rowan. Yeah. The sap band's quite wide, the stuff we have milled. The trees that we've grown here they've got a very wide sap band, probably 1.5 inches, I suppose. It's quite light, and of course that's susceptible to borer.
So these other species, I suppose one of the reasons I got a bandsaw, because you can put a small log on a bandsaw, you can hold it, and you can resaw. Like if you, for example, had picked up some previously milled timber that was 10 by 4 and you wanted to mill it up again, could you re-mill on a Lucas?
Yeah, I can do that.
You'd have to find some way of holding it in place.
Surprisingly enough, I get right down to a small plinth at the bottom of this thing, and all I do is chuck a couple of wedges at each side.
Just to hold it.
And it stays there pretty stable. Once you get down to a piece, the bottom piece only 1 inch deep, it can suddenly throw it into the side of your leg, which is fun, but I just put my leg against it.
Well, the bandsaw is actually, that's interesting because the bandsaw, all the forces go sideways.
Yeah.
Here, you have less force sideways, possibly, because it's more lengthways.
And as I get lower down and perhaps the log's going to move, it doesn't tend to move much, but the last, I do 2 horizontal cuts, which are going to throw the log sideways. I just do a couple of, if I want to do an 8-inch cut or 10-inch cut, do 3-inch cut sort of thing.
So we've been talking about the portable sawmill, and I suppose that becomes the focus of many of us who are milling. But you need a lot of equipment around one. What have you got to get the logs here, and what have you got after you've got a stack of timber? What other?
It's just a farm tractor with forks. That's all I do.
That's all you use. And then you stack the timber. We're sitting on green packs of Sydney blue gum.
Yeah.
They'll go straight to
They'll go straight to Busselton, where they dry it in a kiln and machine it for me to flooring. So I sell this as ready to lay flooring, and I pay the process of drying it and machining it.
Yep.
And you can see some of these boards obviously are starting to cup already, especially in the top.
Oh, the Baxhorn ones.
The Baxhorn ones.
Baxhorn boards do cup.
Yeah.
And but they can. Well, I can do something similar. We could, because we've got a mill that can do the steam reconditioning, which we have to do for some of our species because they're prone to collapse. It also takes out about half the cup, which I found interesting, and then do the drying and then doing the finishing to board. So both of us are doing that process very similar. So for our house, I've effectively done what you've done. They've done the drying and finishing, and we get back the floorboards. And I've got to work out how much money I saved because obviously there's a lot of money in that finishing process. But with the price of timber, I think economically there's a big saving there for those of us who have taken at least the green timber. In another podcast, I'll talk about our solar kiln. We sticker out the timber and dry it, and for all the structural timber in our house, the pine and the eucalypt beams, and for much of the furniture timber we've produced in the past, we've just done it with our solar kiln. But for flooring, I just got a bit nervous and said it's got to be perfect. So that's why I took it to a commercial place to do it. And flooring carries a liability. If someone puts a floor down from your timber and it buckles or moves, and they'll tend to blame the timber, not the environment they've created, which could be right, could be either way. I just don't want to get myself in that situation.
Yeah,
so.
I think a lot of it's to do in the laying and how dry the structure is they're laying it on too. The local guy here is very particular about sealing the base floor, whether it be concrete or MDF.
Okay.
All this milling, all this timber we're milling ends up being only a 12 mil floor.
Yeah.
Not the normal 19 mil goes on bearers. So it either gets laid straight onto concrete, nailed into concrete, or onto MDF. And the floor layer locally says the most important thing to do is to have that structure so it's well sealed. Any moisture will obviously come through concrete.
Yeah, if it's down low on the concrete on the ground, yeah.
And he's very particular about how well the base is sealed. And good point, because I've seen where it hasn't been sealed well and the timber reacts, absorbs moisture and pushes stoves up off the ground and all sorts of weird things.
Timber expansion is very powerful.
Yeah.
I think you've talked before about dado wars pushing
doors out
because of the expansion and contraction and that occurs. Timber just absorbs moisture and releases moisture and it swells as a result in a normal environment. It's interesting. I'm actually going home to lay our shining gum, farm-grown shining gum floor next week, but it's on the second story, so it's sealed effectively by having air all around it.
Yeah.
And
I think we should talk a bit about recovery, right?
Yeah. Okay. Good.
With this particular process of doing my flooring here, I've got an order for nearly 240 square metres, and I'm wondering how many trees I'm going to use and how much recovery I get. I've just worked out I've nearly finished this particular job, and I'm getting about, from the flooring I get out of each log's about 38% recovery.
So recovery to what? To what we're sitting on here, these green boards?
From the round log.
Yep.
To these green sawn wood. I'm not talking about the final product. I'm talking about just ready to go to the floor machinist. So 38% of the log I get in perhaps usable flooring. I've worked out there's probably quite a bit of sawdust, obviously. I think, I worked it out last night. I've milled up about 16 cubes of logs in the round. I've got 6 cubes of sawn product or flooring from it. And I think 2 cubes of sawdust.
Well, and you surprised me last week on the phone. You said you actually make good money from that sawdust.
Well, we have sold a couple of loads of truckloads in my son's large truck, $500 a load. And I worked out roughly I'm getting half a load of sawdust per tree. At say $250 per tree of sawdust. It's better than almost as good as the royalty that the mills used to pay us for the log.
Well, yeah, and that sort of covers your costs, and what we're sitting on is a bonus. It kind of works out well.
And then there's as I get to the edge of the log, there's obviously different sizes. I can't get my normal 130 mil. I can cut some 110 mil wide, which still goes to flooring. And then there's lots of stuff. There's a stack behind us that's like 50 mil and 75 mil wide. We could obviously use for something. And in the edge, I cut strippers or strip sticks to stack timber on. And I was thinking the other day, I went to a local hardware store and tomato steaks are like $2 or $3 each for 6-foot tomato steaks. So perhaps I should be cutting tomato steaks. So the recovery...
We're talking about these beautiful trees ending up in tomato steaks. Not all of it. Yeah. So that's clear. Recovery is the amount of product you're going to get out of the initial log, and it depends on what your market is, the size of the product. People often overemphasise recovery, but I'm saying, well, if you want 100% recovery, just use the round pole and stick it in the ground. If you need a floor, you can't use a round pole.
No.
You've got to mill it up. So there'll always be, the more processing you do, there'll be losses through the process.
Yeah, and when you get back to the flooring that we're sitting on, here it's I allow for about another 20% to come out of that we'll lose.
You'll lose it after it's gone through the next
obviously
process.
It's got to go through the machining process, and they'll find more faults that I dock out a lot of knots and stuff as I go, but there'll be cracks that happen in the drying process and twists and cups that will come out. But invariably, what I send over there, I get 20% less.
Yep.
From the flooring process. Yeah.
So it's good to do the numbers, particularly if you're selling the product and trying to work out how much you're actually, how much value you're getting out of spending a day harvesting a tree. Well, let's take one of these trees. They're about 35 metres tall, we were saying, and 80 centimetres in diameter, say. What's the volume? How much stem log is there, and how much work's involved in?
I'm getting about 5 to 7 lengths of mill log per tree.
3 metre lengths.
3 metre lengths, or we'll say 4 3 metre lengths, and then a couple of 2.5 metre lengths. And once you get into the crown of the tree, obviously there's lots of branches and larger branches that you can't process in the flooring. Small branches can probably get through, but the large ones you just stock out. And some very large longs, some where they all come out of the tree in the one spot, I just dock that section of tree off. But with flooring, you've got the advantage of they can utilise anything down to 50 centimetres long, so it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, and they end match them, and they go on a base, so they don't have to go across a joist and be lost,
so
more loss in the process.
The advantage of utilising a lot more with flooring than you do. Say with structural timber, obviously you can't have big knots in the middle of your...
No, you can't. You can't have short lengths of timber.
Yeah.
So these are all pruned trees. They were pruned when they were young, up to about 6.5 or 7 metres, I think. And then you've got a section where there's larger branches, and you're getting some timber out of that, as we discussed for flooring, from between the large branches. And then from the top part of the tree, you cut up a lot of firewood. Yeah. When we were here with the Master Tree Grower group, you showed us one tree, all the logs and all the firewood you got out. And there wasn't much left to burn. A few,
No, well, I've got a portable chipper too that fits on the 3-point linkage, a tractor, or Adam's industrial chipper that he takes for his arborist work. You can chip all the leaves and smaller branches. There's nothing left really. If I can sell the sawdust and the tomato stakes and the chips and the firewood. Actually, we cut a lot of firewood on the farm as well, and I guess that's the ultimate in recovery, because
you burn everything you cut,
apart from the sawdust coming off to cut the rings.
So it's and have you got markets? You got markets for most of those products now?
Yeah. Flooring, the firewood markets. Everyone still seems to want to keep warm with an open fire or.
And with the closure of native forests, is that changing the firewood prices?
I think what's happening is people are starting to use other species for firewood, like even Tassie blue gum, and firewood manufacturers are using anything now because people still want to burn wood.
It used to be it had to be jarrah, or you couldn't, it was crap, But blue gum is actually a bit denser than jarrah.
And it's a good firewood. It makes a bit more ash. Tends to keep the fire going just as long as jarrah, if not a bit longer.
Yeah. So people are getting a bit more flexible. That's good. So the recovery of the bandsaw mill, it so depends on what you're cutting out and the quality, but I suspect it could, just because of the sawdust alone, it could be, if you were cutting the same product the same way, presumably you get a bit more.
Yeah, I think I
40 for 50% recovery.
Last night, I think out of a cubic metre of sawn product, I can approximately say I'll get 30 square metres of flooring ready to lay. And I worked out the difference in the two curves last night roughly, and I think I'd get an extra 2 square metres per cubic metre if I had a bandsaw.
So a couple of $100 more from the log on the bandsaw. As I said before, to me, recovery can only be discussed in reference to the product you're producing. And for people to go around and say that this mill produces a better recovery than that mill doesn't mean a lot unless they're producing the same product. And so you need to be careful of that. And I much prefer the idea of value recovery. How much value are we getting out of that log? And that depends on that person's opportunity to sell that and add value in some way. So milling is really about finding the right mill to suit some of the markets that you're going to deliver and also match the resource you've got. And more of us as landholders who've been planting trees for more than 20 years, and David and I have these trees I'm looking at, what are we up to now? 37 years old. Yeah. And neither of us are ever going to clear fell our forests as in like conventional forestry. We're talking, I suppose we often mention to each other, we have this perpetual forest and you've got the choice each day to go out and spend some time harvesting one tree and look at value you can get from that one tree. But you've still got a forest. You've got hundreds of trees and you've got other trees growing.
It's like a magic pudding. You cut one down and the other tree next to it grows a bit faster.
Right. Yeah,
grows
so
a bit better.
I tend to go out and pick trees that match what I'm looking for, but also mean that I'd leave the forest in a better condition because there's a tree next to it or under it or around it who needs some more space. And there's this great aspiration I have that we have forests across farms that are continually producing products, lots of different products. We'll have more sophisticated sawmills in some areas, taking the majority of the logs, particularly if they're, if most growers are growing one or two species, maybe a big mill can come in and start taking that. But there'll always be other lesser known species or one-off trees that these smaller mills can deal with.
And they produce either a bandsaw mill or a Lucas mill. You can mill short logs only a metre long if you want to.
Yeah. And no one's going to load them on a log truck and take them anywhere.
Fall between the staunchions. The other thing is time. Comparing the two mills, time to on a bandsaw, you've got to cut the things into larger bulks, and then you have to physically rotate them, which is much easier on your mill with the hydraulics.
I've got the hydraulics to rotate the log. It's fantastic.
The advantage on the Lucas mill is you're just cutting through the log, and every time you cut, you've got a piece of wood you can cut out. And
well, you talked about paying someone, but what about yourself? Do you enjoy a day milling?
I do. Yeah. But it's too slow on your own.
Oh, too slow on your own. Yeah.
Yeah, because you've got to walk out each piece of wood and put it.
Yeah, well, I tend to do it all on my own. I sort of get in the zone, and I'm just enjoying thinking about it, where the next cut will be, getting the best result. Yeah. But timber is, as friends of ours told me who run a mill, it's just manual handling. You're forever moving stuff around. I think for our house building, I must have touched every stick of timber 3 or 4 times since it came off the mill. And gee, there's a lot of expense associated with that in terms of time.
I don't think people who walk around on the floor appreciate that. I think people think floors, they all go chase for the cheapest thing.
Well, they'll end up with the manufactured product because all that extra work doesn't have to be done.
Yeah, but when you see how much time you handle on one piece of wood, it's a bit like even firewood. I worked out the other day cutting firewood for our own house. I handle each piece of wood 8 times before I get it into the fire.
Just put in a wood boiler. We'll have a show about that as well. No, thanks, David. Well, we're going to catch up and talk every time I'm over there. Over here, we'll talk silviculture and eucalypt sawlogs, because this property we're on here, or this shed we're in. I didn't even talk about that. It's all made out of your farm-grown timber. We've got a pole shed with boards on the wall, all cut from timber in this particular paddock we're right in, and that. We're building a house. Not every landholder is going to build a house with their own sawmill, but we all use timber. Yeah. And if a neighbour's got a mill or someone, it's really important community asset. I have people bringing logs over all the time. Blackwood log fell down. Can you mill it up? Yeah. And you sort of feel like it's part of what a community can have to get that. And so people aren't going out and buying timber, and they're sitting down at a table that they grew.
We grew the shed, and our son Adam, he did the process of building it. He's done a fantastic job, and it's nothing more pleasurable than growing a tree, milling it, and then building something from it.
Yeah, and I think both of us are worried about people who just say you can't cut trees down because they're beautiful as they are, and I say, well, you haven't you don't know what it feels like to sit at a table you grew.
Yeah.
That's also beautiful. It's
Yeah.
also part of the story of the tree.
Yeah.
It's not like it's the end when the tree falls, because that forest is still there. The way we're managing our forests is perpetual. And so the forest is still there, providing all those values. But on top of that, we've got the additional locking up carbon, sitting at a table with your grandchildren that you actually grew on the farm. It's a great pleasure. And these machines just allow us to expand diversify our farm production, get more value out of our forests, and also add value to our whole asset, which is the capital of our farm.
Yeah, great.
So thanks very much, David. We'll see how this goes and possibly have some more. But I love coming over here, and it's one of the most beautiful tree growing farms in the country or world. I travel a lot, and if I saw this overseas, I'd be blown away. But it's right here in Western Australia's backyard. We're down near Bridgetown in the southwest. Just to help people out, what's the rainfall here? What are we sort of
Getting less.
Getting less, dropping.
The original rainfall here was 800 millimetres, I think,
Yeah.
in a year. But,
And you've got about, so I'm going to guess, 500 acres. What's the property?
600 acres. Yeah.
600 acres.
230 hectares.
Run beef cows, used to have sheep.
Yeah.
It's a multi-enterprise farm, and it's much more diverse now because timber is a product on top of conventional agriculture.
Yeah, and the other advantage is that it's like it's what I call a Zimmer frame. I'll be able to keep walking backwards and forwards. But when I'm 90, it's just...
That's right, you
as
lean on the frame.
You lean on the frame, as long as the logs aren't too big, and you can just select small logs and just walk backwards and forwards. You end up in the same spot each time.
Yeah, well, I hope it keeps the dementia away as well.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. We'll see how we go. And
Thanks, Ryan.
I'll put a forward and an end on this, and we'll see what people think of our little podcast discussions. Thanks a lot, David.
Oh, great. See you.